Fantasy V was initially released in Japan on the Super Famicom, however the game would never see a SNES release in America or Europe. Instead, the game was ported to the PlayStation for Japan 6 years later, 7 years later for America, and an entire decade later for Europe after its original release in 1992. The game was bundled with another Final Fantasy for its non-Japanese PlayStation releases. Final Fantasy Anthology in America brought its audience Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI, previously known as Final Fantasy III. And in Europe, the same anthology gave its gamers Final Fantasy IV and V. When the game hit the age of 14 years old, it was finally remade for the Game Boy Advance. An unknown force is draining the power of the four crystals, disrupting the balance of nature. The future of the planet is uncertain until the arrival of a lone hero. Does this recycled and aging story sound familiar? Final Fantasy V revolves around a young traveller named Butts and the people he meets on his journey. The job system makes a welcome return from Final Fantasy III, with various upgrades and a lot more customisable options, but that's one of the very few upgrades from Final Fantasy IV. As previously mentioned, the storyline is dry and boring, and the five main characters, Butts, Lena, Faris, Galuf and Crilly, are distinctively lacking in the character development department. The sound quality is unevolved from Final Fantasy IV, and the visuals are only marginally better, but the colour palette used seemed a tad washed out. Final Fantasy V uses the same ATB system as seen in Final Fantasy IV, with a slight upgrade, the ATB bar. Next to each character's name, it's the ATB bar. You see it gradually filling up. Once full, that character may act. This gives the player more strategic depth to his or her battle fighting. Final Fantasy V again has a unique method of transportation. Aside from boats and airships, you can even fly via a wyvern. Sid marks his appearance here as an engineer whom helps modify the protagonist's airship. One of the more impressive characters from Final Fantasy V was actually an enemy named Gilgamesh, the first reoccurring mini-boss in the Final Fantasy series. Probably the least favourite Final Fantasy of mine. Playing this game felt more like a chore than fun, with its ridiculously high encounter rate and the sheer boring story. Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals is a 4-part anime mini-series based on the Final Fantasy series. Legend of the Crystals takes place 200 years after the events of Final Fantasy V, and, as if the story to Final Fantasy V wasn't recycled enough, Legend of the Crystals has practically the same plot line behind it, and with different characters. The main protagonist, Pritz, teams up with Linari, a descendant of Butts from Final Fantasy V, and together they must save the world. Legend of the Crystals features a lot of over-the-top action, witty one-liners, and a lot of shots of the main heroine's underwear, typical of a 90s anime. Of particular note is the amount of comedic material inserted into the series. In this way, Legend of the Crystals appears to be both a parody and a homage to Final Fantasy V.